This is the third tutorial in a series on the Home Cost Allocation tool. As noted in the introduction, before plugging numbers into the tool itself, there are two key evaluations a PJ must make off the sheet. The second tutorial covered the issue of unit comparability, and in this segment we will talk about distinguishing between costs that are home eligible and those that are ineligible for home funding. While home is a highly flexible source of project funding, the regulation requires that home funds only be dispersed towards home-eligible costs, which are outlined in Section 92.206 of the Home Final Rule. Section 92.214 also identifies a range of specifically prohibited activities and costs that cannot be paid for with home funds. Delineating a project's total cost between home-eligible and ineligible items then serves two purposes. First, we need it for cost allocation. When determining how many units in the project must be designated as home units, we will look only at the home-eligible project cost. Second, when a PJ is actually dispersing its funds during the development phase, it needs to ensure that on a draw-by-draw basis, it is only dispersing toward home-eligible cost, consistent with the budget that was established in the project's written agreement. While we're not trying to cover underwriting in these tutorials, it is important to note two other issues about costs that are not eligible for home. Just because a cost isn't eligible to be paid with home doesn't mean it can't be included in the project's overall budget. There are several items that home can't pay for directly that are still critical to the success of a project. For example, capitalizing certain reserves, as we'll talk more about later. So just because home can't pay for a given cost doesn't necessarily mean that item can't be included in the overall budget. At the same time, however, the fact that home isn't specifically paying for a given item doesn't relieve a PJ from evaluating whether that cost is reasonable and appropriate. Home is fundamentally intended to provide gap financing, so any cost that is unreasonable or excessive adds to the gap that home is ultimately filling, no matter which specific items home is dispersed toward. Let's go through some of the more common project costs that are not home eligible and need to be excluded for cost allocation purposes. Most common hard construction costs are eligible, but there are a few items to watch out for. First, home can only pay for construction costs associated with residential buildings. So freestanding accessory buildings that don't include residential units are ineligible costs. This might include a freestanding leasing office and community building, standalone maintenance sheds, or garages and carports that aren't physically connected to the residential buildings. When these types of common areas, like a laundry room or community room, are in a structure that includes residential units, then those construction costs are eligible. It's only when they're in a freestanding structure without residential space that we have to exclude them. I would also note here briefly that home can only pay for non-luxury housing. So for example, the program doesn't pay for the cost of swimming pools. And to the degree that market rate units are being provided with various premium upgrades compared to the affordable units, the cost of those upgrades need to be identified and broken out separately. Another construction cost we need to watch out for is off-site infrastructure. While home can pay for on-site improvements like underground infrastructure, drives and parking areas and the like, it cannot pay for off-site costs. So for projects that have to pay for a new turn lane on the public street adjacent to the project site, or to extend water and sewer lines down the street to make the site buildable, or other similar items, those off-site costs are ineligible for home funding. The only exception to this is that the cost of connecting to the public infrastructure, like the water and sewer leads, are okay even though they extend beyond the property line. Other costs that are ineligible for home include capitalized reserves. The sole exception to this is that home can be used to fund a lease-up or rent-up reserve to cover initial operating deficits occurring in the period between construction completion and break-even operations, not to exceed 18 months. Other common reserves, including a general operating reserve, capitalized replacement reserve deposits, or the like, cannot be paid for with home funds. Home also cannot be used to pay for a project's operating cost, so initial startup costs like working capital or marketing, if those are itemized separately from and in addition to a lease-up reserve, should also be excluded. Furniture, fixtures, and equipment, or FF&E, are also ineligible. This usually represents things like office equipment in the leasing office, exercise equipment in a fitness center, or computers in a computer lab. One way to think of this is that these are not costs of the real estate itself, but are personal property. particularly in projects with tax credits involved. The costs associated with establishing the partnership or limited liability company and those associated with the syndication of tax credits need to be excluded. These are often labeled as organizational or syndication costs and should include any investor or syndicator fees or due diligence costs that are included in the budget. However, the fees charged by the state tax credit allocating agency, often including a reservation and a monitoring fee, are acceptable. Effectively, HUD views these as financing fees which are allowable under 92206D rather than costs that are internal to the ownership entity itself or to their related parties. Remember, while 92214 highlights certain specific ineligible items, that list isn't necessarily exhaustive. In fact, the structure of the regulation is the reverse. To be home eligible, a cost must be included in the description of what the program can fund in 92206. Before we look at a case study, let's talk about some practical tips for PJs and other program participants. First, in an ideal world, PJs will update their application materials, including any pro forma or budget formats, to clearly itemize ineligible cost so they can be easily removed. And there are a lot of formats out there that do this, so you might look at what other state housing finance agencies or other PJs are doing. But in the real world, we recognize that developers often use different formats or presentations of cost. This is often driven by each funder or financing source having its own format, and applicants trying to present the same cost in different ways as a result. So it's often necessary to seek additional breakdowns of project cost when a line item may have both eligible and ineligible costs combined in it. For example, it's common to have to ask for additional detail to break out the construction cost of accessory structures from the overall construction contract. Even then, there will sometimes be some ambiguity, so it's best to be conservative when identifying those costs that will be treated as ineligible for home. If a given line item isn't clear or obviously includes both eligible and ineligible cost, treat it as ineligible. Additionally, it's a good idea to exclude any budgeted contingency and treat that as an ineligible cost too. There are two reasons for this. First, it's possible the contingency won't get used at all. On the other hand, even if the contingency is used, we don't know if it will be needed for costs that are home eligible or costs that are ineligible for home funding. Maybe the contingency gets used towards unexpected off-site infrastructure costs, which have to be excluded anyway. When you follow this advice, the worst thing that happens is you may end up over-designating the home units, designating more home units that are minimally required. It's always permissible for a PJ to over-designate the units in a project. Cost allocation is really getting at the absolute minimum that we need to assign to home. So erring on the side of caution helps ensure that we get that, especially if things change during development. And that's also a good reminder that cost allocation, just like underwriting, isn't really a one-time evaluation. It's entirely normal for a project's cost to change somewhat during the development period, and PJs need to keep track of those changes to ensure that the project is still viable and compliant, including that the number of home-designated units is appropriate in the scope of the overall project. So at a minimum, PJs need to recheck the cost allocation at the point of project completion, when the actual and final sources and uses are known. In some cases, it will be necessary to adjust the number of home units as a result of these changes. So it's a good idea to include a provision in the written agreement that allows PJs to make changes to the unit designations at project completion based on a final cost allocation review. So let's take a look at a real project budget. For those who watched the segment on unit comparability, this is the budget from Case Study A, where we determined that the units were comparable. This is the initial and relatively high-level budget format provided by the developer. Where do we need to pay attention, ask questions, and get more detail? First, we need to better understand the construction cost. Are there costs for off-site infrastructure included here? Or does the development include freestanding accessory structures? We need to figure that out. As we see further down, the budget for other seems to relate to a clubhouse and marketing, so that gives us a clue there's likely a freestanding building. Of course, we'll know that for sure from reviewing the plans. Next, I've got 3 other line items that jump out at me. These include the lines for legal and organizational cost, syndication fees, and tax credit fees. It's likely that taken together, these lines include both eligible and ineligible cost. In particular, we need to better understand how much of these relate to the organizational and partnership cost, and if any investor or syndication costs are included. Maybe those are embedded in the low-income housing tax credit fees line, rather than being called out separately in the line for syndication fees that right now is showing a 0. There are also some reserves. It looks like some combination of operating and capitalized replacement reserve deposits are included, so we need to exclude those as well. Finally, 2 other line items suggest the need for more clarity. Anytime we see other, it's worth trying to understand what that line really represents. Here we see both a clubhouse line and marketing, both of which are suspect costs. The clubhouse might be the actual cost of building the standalone clubhouse, or maybe it's for furnishing the clubhouse. And marketing may be important, but it's really an operating cost, which is something home can't pay for. As we've discussed earlier, there's really no way of knowing initially if or how the contingency will be used. So when it's all said and done, and keeping in mind the suggestion of erring on the side of caution, here's how I'm initially going to characterize the cost when it comes time to fill out the cost allocation worksheet for this project. Of the almost $13.3 million total project cost, we've identified just over $1.1 million of costs that are clearly or potentially ineligible for home. So later, when we use the Case Study A information to fill out the proration method worksheet, we'll come back to these numbers and see how they all play out.